Anu, I'm very glad you have touched the point of my lived experience. I was 15 years old in the ashram, and it was 15th of August 1947. What I can say is that we had darshan of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. And the mother had a celebration in the ashram itself. I regret that I don't have a personal recollection of what happened. All that I felt was that this another year. The atmosphere was different at that time. But what would be interesting is to say something about what Mother did that day in the ashram. She read out an invocation morning of 15th August 47. Just a few lines from that invocation I would like to read out and share. She said, "O our Mother, O soul of India, Mother who has never forsaken thy children, even in the days of darkest depression, guide us so that the horizon of freedom opening before us may be also a horizon of true greatness and of thy true life in the community of the nations. Guide us so that we may be always on the side of great ideals and show to men thy true visage as a leader in the ways of the Spirit and a friend and helper of all the people." And she hoisted the spiritual flag of India, which is blue with a golden symbol of mothers, on the terrace above Sri Aurobindo's room. In the afternoon, thousands of people who had gathered for the darshan of August 15th assembled in the courtyard of the ashram and sang the Vande Mataram. Mother appeared on the first terrace, gave her darshan, and responded to the singing of the Vande Mataram by saying, "Jai Hind." In the evening, the courtyard of the ashram was illuminated. About the darshan, I would like to share. My parents and younger brother were in the ashram, but I always went alone for darshan. I wanted to stand alone before Sri Aurobindo, the mother. Well, I was saying, since the age of 12, I wanted to stand alone at darshan time. All I wanted to do was to look at them, as long as I was allowed to stand and then asked to move on in the queue. But the mother carried another air. That's a very living vibration of the day that as a 15-year-old I carry. Other details I have taken from historical records, but I can't recollect them. But everything changed in Mother's action from then onwards. Followed the 50s, Sri Aurobindo left the body on December 5th, 1950. She actively concentrated on the merger of the former French territories with India, which took place in 54. As soon as that happened, she wrote to the President of India asking for Indian citizenship. That was the first step that she took. And in that decade of the 50s, all the leaders of public life in the country and all walks of life came to pay their respects to Mother and to visit the ashram. To name just a few, Dr. Radhakrishnan, Pandit Nehru, Indira Gandhi, up to Vinoba Bhave, and the literary figures and the people in the field of education. And they carried back in their respective areas of work in the country the work and mission of Sri Aurobindo and the existence of the ashram. I was, as a young student, part of the work of receiving these guests, looking after them. So I saw how much attention Mother gave to each one who came. And suddenly the ashram was all over the country. After that, I went to the Sorbonne in Paris to read again the work of Sri Aurobindo in the context of European thought and culture. That's when the five dreams came into a very clear focus for me and of great immediate relevance. In fact, Leave the Chevet at that time for me was that essay of Sri Aurobindo called The Reminiscences of India, which was signed by him. And the 60s was a time of great change. India had achieved her freedom. Most of the Asian countries had achieved their freedom, which was the first dream of Sri Aurobindo's. The second dream of a world union was beginning to take shape already. The common market, the European Union, they were taking shape in Europe with whatever difficulties. But the third was already on the way. Late 60s was a tremendous shake-up in the civilization of Europe and America, in the field of education, in the field of social living, in the field of new ideas of the future. And the youth of the time was beginning to look ahead, not look at the past, not look at history, but look what it had to create for the future. By that time, international organizations, the international institutions like the United Nations in New York and its subsidiaries in judiciary, in culture, in education and labor were set up all over the world. That had already happened after the Second World War. So that was a fact which was like a preparation for the kind of upheaval that already took place late 60s and early 70s. And at that time, there was a shift of outlook. The thinking minds of the West were already beginning to look eastwards. They were beginning to look at India. They were beginning to look at her psychology, at her worldview, not yet of spiritual practice, but in a very. But Western civilization had a big shake-up. In fact, it used to be very commonly said and written in many books by philosophers of Europe at that time that Western civilization has come to an end and a new curve of civilization has to begin. Shankito was one of those who wrote that, who was one of the leading philosophers of the time from the Sorbonne and the Collège de France. And things in America were also changing. There were new groups, new societies who were beginning to look into the future. The United Nations itself in the middle of 1970, and it was important because I happened to be part of that assembly, and Mother had sent me there on behalf of Auroville, strangely enough. So I'm conscious of how these things were linked up. It was an assembly of young university people from all over the world. There were about almost 1,000 assembled there for 3 weeks. And they were asked to give their ideas of the future. This, I think, was a very significant point, and it connects with the 5 dreams of Sri Aurobindo. They were asked to say frankly and freely what kind of future did they look for. This was in July 1970 in the United Nations, in politics, in economics, in culture, in education, in the way of life, in worldviews. And unanimously, all the young university people thought of holistic views, integral. These words, holistic, integral, began to cast their seeds. But the seeds have begun to sprout now. This was in 70. And there was a very strong inner intuition that the future is going to be built here in India. I was not aware of Auroville at that time. That came into my picture a little later. But I had already a sense of it. And I have a feeling that the first 3 dreams were already not an embryo, but actually on the ground, but not yet in their fullness. In Asia, on the other hand, there were some movements like SARC and others, but they have not yet taken root, frankly. That is yet to happen. I can only say that in the new millennium, last 2 decades, the last 2 dreams have become very important. It so happened that I was invited to the US very often in these 20 years. Everywhere there was a need to know of the spiritual practices of India, to see how they could be worked out, and of the psychology of India, the work of Sri Aurobindo, and there was a great need to understand. There were small groups and large groups, and there was an attraction to Auroville which was growing at that time, to come to the movement that we are living through now. Now, you see a humanity that moves around with masks on the face in every country, in every nation. They go through meetings of world leaders, knocking elbows because they can't read each other otherwise. Somewhere a civilization that we have been building up assiduously, I would say since the 16th century in recent history. The mind in the forefront, planning, organizing, leading or trying to lead, and the great discoveries in the natural sciences, especially physics and biology, they've all folded up. The world board is swept clean. I have the impression that what was in preparation from late 60s and early 70s has now come to a point where it has collapsed. That preparation was necessary. And now all the foremost thinkers, scientists, leaders of the present time and a younger generation are conscious that a new civilization has to arise if we have to survive. Humanity cannot survive at the present moment as it is the case. It's not possible. That denouement has come only now. In that context, I'm more than aware of the 50 years existence of the Auroville experience. Here is a collectivity of many generations come from more than 50 countries in a dedicated attempt to recreate their whole personality, to discover the spiritual being, and to create patterns of living down to the most physical. Down to the most physical. How you live, how you act, how you eat, how you dress, how you organize life as a group, as an international group, irrespective of religion, but a seeking for the spiritual. That exists. And India has had the wisdom and the audacity, I would like to use that word, to host the experiments in 50 years and to nurture it, to help it to grow on the soil of India. The fact that it exists is a hope that the future is not an impossibility. And the fact that people are attracted to Auroville is a further sign that it helps us move forward. More, it is too early to say, but the visions of Sri Aurobindo and the mother that have, I would say, traveled around the world and come to rest in Auroville, in a given spot on earth. Earth is important, with Mate Mandir as its center. This is not to be taken lightly. The 60s in Paris was a tremendous experience, and especially if one were at the Sorbonne. Suddenly, there was a generation that did not want this historically century-old tradition of education that had existed in Europe. They rejected it like that. It was also a shock. But they wanted something new, and they were ready to fight for it. And what they wanted in the future, they said they used to have graffiti in those days, which they put up on the walls. And there are many people, Aurovillians, who were there at that time. But the youngsters said, we want to be educated for the future, not by the past. That was what they said. We want to know what is the future. They burnt books, the professors resigned, and here was I. I was at the Sorbonne. It was very funny. I was always wearing a sari. I was reading the Life Divine of Sri Aurobindo. I had the Life Divine tucked in my arm, and I used to walk from Sri University to Sorbonne every day through all the fights. Suddenly, as it happened, the social groups in Paris, they joined the student movement. Then the labor joined the movement. And in fact, de Gaulle had to resign. The government had to resign because of that. When this work was done, the movement shifted to Berkeley in the US. It had come from Germany with Cohen-Bendit. Paris was the hot center. Then it went to Berkeley. And you know what happened in Californian region in the early 70s. It went off. Lots of strange things happened, drugs and whatnot. But in July 70, there was this very interesting meeting at the United Nations in New York. I didn't know Auroville at that time. The mother wrote me a letter. I was still in Paris. She said, I want you to go to this and to represent Auroville. Auroville I did not know, but I thought, well, there's representing Sri Aurobindo. I saw it like that. So those 3 weeks in the United Nations in New York, suddenly you saw that and they were from all countries of the world, including Russia. The only country not representing was North Korea. That was in July 1970. And they all said one thing, we want to work together in collaboration for the future in all fields. Now, that must have cast a seed, but there was no immediate result. 70s was a difficult time in the US. It was a difficult time, people experimenting in all directions. But I was very sure after that I had to come back. I'd finished my work in Sorbonne. I wrote to mother. I told her all that had happened. And she said, go and work in Auroville. Auroville was new to me. And slowly the work came into Bharat Nivas. And in March 71, she gave me a long talk, personally, her last interview on India. I landed up in Bharat Nivas, and that's where we are today. But, after that work carried on, then suddenly I started to receive invitations from the US, and I had no attraction to go there. So for about 12, 15 years, I went there very often. Small centers, bigger centers, and suddenly their interest was in Indian psychology, Sri Aurobindo's works, in Auroville, what was happening. And there were many people who said, but we feel like what Auroville is all about, but they'd never heard of it. They'd never heard of Sri Aurobindo. So in a sense, the sense of what Auroville stands for was there in the hearts of people. And what's happening today, all wearing masks, is a horrible impression. I must say that. Horrible in the sense, you must realize that how urgent it is for us to make the next step in evolution. A certain period of human civilization, we have done well with it, no harm. We have reached awards, we have made discoveries, but it's finished. And the next level of conscious being is the pressure of the supermind. I must say something in this respect which is important. This was it's around February 28th, 1970. February 28th. I was having the soutanas of my PhD thesis at the Sorbonne, which is on Sri Aurobindo and Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. Like it happens in the Sorbonne, there are 3 members of the jury. The president of the jury was a logician. His name was René Poirier. He knew nothing of India, nothing of Sri Aurobindo. He had just read the thesis. It was a long thesis. He said something very interesting to me, which I've never forgotten. He was a logician, remember that. He said, Madam, I find the concept of supermind very interesting. His words. This was February 28th, 1970. If we had more time, I would have liked to discuss that with you. I've never forgotten that. René Poirier was his name. And then the last book, last testament of an eminent philosopher called Jean Guiton of Collège de France, Sorbonne, everything. In his last book, he says, and he was a member of the Vatican Council. He was also there. Only lay member of the Vatican Council. His last sentence in his last book was, humanity is going through a veritable mutation. For him to use the word mutation, and this was around 94, 93, 94, about that time. These two I remember very strongly somehow.